Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, the Institute's president, and it's our privilege today to host a very forward-thinking and courageous, in a policy sense, longtime colleague, Dr. Laurence Boone. Laurence is the Minister of State for Europe for the French Republic, She holds a PhD from the London School of from London Business School, as well as other degrees from France and the UK. Previously, before taking this role, she served as chief economist of the OECD and briefly as deputy secretary general, I believe. She's previously worked in both the public and private sectors, including for American financial firms in France, but also um, she has been an advisor to several French governments on specific projects and spent time in let me make sure I get the date right, in 2014 as Sherpa and special advisor for multilateral and European economic and financial affairs. Part of the reason we're so excited to have Dr. Boone with us today, Minister Boone, is because she has the sense of practicality and political economy that takes someone from being an economic researcher to being an economic influencer and now policymaker. This is a unique time in Europe, given the barbaric Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also given developments of European unification and integration of recent years. And this comes in a period where Europe is finding its a new strategic role in a world where China, US, and other conflicts are cropping up. Almost precisely a year ago, we had at this very podium Christine Lagarde, president of the European Central Bank, who gave a speech regarding economic statecraft and friendshoring and topics like that. This issue has not gone away. It has, if anything, become more important. And we are thrilled to have Laurence Boone give us another talk, a different view, the French official view now on economic statecraft. Thank you.
Thank you. First, thanks, Adam, for the very kind and over generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be back in DC and to be able to discuss these issues with you. So my warmest thanks, and I'm very grateful to the Peterson for hosting so many interesting discussions, and I hope I'll be able to match the interest. As Adam was saying, I will be speaking about economics statecraft, which you all know very well, and I'm surprised, how many people are increasingly discussing about it outside the US. And what I mean by economic statecraft is obviously putting economic and trade policy tools at the service of foreign policy goals. And I think in most cases, when people think about statecraft, they are thinking about military, sanctions, Cold War. And I think, to be fair, most of the tools that we are usually thinking about for economic statecraft reflect this. It's sanctions, it's export controls, it's investment screening, it's trade tariffs, it's financial market restrictions. But it also has a positive side to it through incentives and, again, trade agreements, development finance, cultural influence, all of this, and cooperation, including on global issues such as climate change, cybercrime, or pandemics. All of those are about statecraft as well. So by mentioning Christine Lagarde talking last year, you cut my next sentence because I was very affirmative, saying, "Oh, why talking about statecraft today?" but I will stick to it. I think people do not expect Europe to speak so much about statecraft, and obviously the world has been changing over the last year. And what I wanted to do today was to convey how the European Union is building its own vision of economic statecraft. And I think it's very important to convey the EU view and construction, which is not in opposition to a US view or a China view, but which really wants to laid the foundation for a transatlantic partnership and some, I was about to say, reasonable statecraft. And this is about taking into account, obviously, the combination of our enormous interdependencies, but also geopolitical tension, and to address together the rise of what we call illiberal economies in the world. Okay, what's peculiar, I think, about the EU when we talk about statecraft is that we have a DNA of doing free trade. And this has been the European engine of growth and prosperity and peace. And we still have to do that, but taking into account our new security environment. And let me start with an example which will highlight how different we are when we look at this from other countries. So let me take the example that Peterson knows very well, which is that of the chips industry. And all of you know we need chips for connectivity, for cars, for cloud technology, for defense, for space, and this is set to continue rising. Aggregate chips demand has been tripling since 2019. It's set to double by 2030. And obviously this reflects the state of the world because the different steps of semiconductor value chains include critical raw materials, not necessarily from friendly countries. They're concentrated in a small number of countries. And the entire chain for semiconductor production goes through a variety of countries and sometimes back and forth. So what have the US and the EU done about this? I think, but I will wait for your feedback. The US has been designing both carrots and sticks with the Chips for America Fund. So companies can benefit from public subsidies, but they have to limit their commercial activity in some foreign countries for 10 years, and they face strict export controls. So it's the combination of industrial policy with foreign policy to protect, or the intentions to protect research, innovation, and to control the diffusion of advanced technologies. Now in Europe, we also have a CHIPS Act. But it's a little different because its objective is to develop innovation and production capacity in the EU, like for the US. But there is no restriction attached on exports or on the use of those innovations and technology beyond the regular export control that we have on military or dual-use equipment. So as you can see, it's a lot more about carrots and very little about sticks. Now, at the national level within the EU, sometimes it's different. And all of you have seen the ASML story, the Dutch company that's producing leading-edge semiconductor. They have a dominant share in lithography equipment. And here the Dutch government has been banning some of the production that it has, some of the most advanced production. And what's interesting is they've been banning some production, but in a more restricted way than what was asked from them before. And what's even more interesting, I find, is they've done this using an EU regulation. And I think that's particularly interesting because it's been done at the national level, but the anchor on the EU regulation is a signal that we need to actually do more at the EU level. Because obviously, if there was another firm in the EU producing the same semiconductor, nothing would prevent them from selling them. And the EU regulation that has been used, and that's also, I think, particularly interesting, cites prevention of terrorism and human rights violation as the specific intensities of public security interest. So it's really anchored into something that is dangerous. Okay, so I wanted to talk about this example just to have an example reflecting the differences in the approach of statecraft between the US and the EU. And that is exactly what I would like to share with you today. First, that the EU is doing more statecraft than what is commonly thought, but in a different way. It has been very defensive for many years, just protecting our market. It's becoming a little more assertive, not offensive, and it still has in its mind the fact that we need to partner with many countries and not cut ourselves, not go into a blocks logic. Okay, so you all know the reasons why we should be, nevertheless, a bit less naive and have some economic statecraft. That's because first, dependencies are vulnerabilities, and COVID has been demonstrating the vulnerabilities of supply chain and how interconnected our economies are. You've been writing and reading about production bottleneck, natural resources concentration, so I won't go in there long. So not only do dependencies are vulnerabilities, but now a rising number of countries are actually manipulating these dependencies. And we all know that China has been relying on trade and investment around the world to achieve its foreign policy objectives, and I have not been shy of talking about it. China is also largely endowed with critical commodities. It's supplying 2/3 of the world's critical raw material. That's a lot. It hosts most of the global cobalt refining capacity. It's the first trade partner of most African countries. And it is now the first holder of developing countries' sovereign debt globally. There was very timely Financial Times articles about a Harvard study on this. So China is most likely the only country having control over all or almost all of the supply chain of electric vehicle batteries. There is China, there is Russia, and it's different because Russia has been using energy and to some extent grain as a weapon in the war of aggression against Ukraine. Not just in direct conflict, but also to weigh on the support of Ukraine, particularly in Europe, but also in all of Africa and the Middle East. And this has been what they've done, manipulating the grain supply, has been having cascading effect on global commodities market and with energy on global energy markets. So as you know, energy prices have been rising and it's undermining Europeans' competitiveness, the objective also being to talk directly to consumer and weaken their support for Ukraine. So the vulnerabilities that we have, these dependencies, they've been used in different ways by these two countries, but there are obviously others. I think a third element to think and reflect on statecraft is that multilateralism is weakening. There are more fragmentation than like-mindedness in multilateral instances. And for example, G20 hasn't been able to sign a communique for quite a while now. We're struggling to get a common position on Russia's aggression. WTO is not able to act with the speed and efficiency that we need to ensure a level playing field when protectionist measures are being put in place or in the face of non-market practices. So these are the three main reasons, I think, why we need to think a bit more strategically. Now, one of the things I really wanted to to leave you with, and I hope it will be the case, is to convince you that Europe has the potential for economic statecraft. First, it's one of the largest economies in the world with 440 million people, okay? So we are way more than Americans. And these 440 million people, they have GDP per head of about 25,000 euros. This is big. It's the world's largest trading area. It ranks first in terms of both inbound and outbound investment. It's the top trading partner of 80 countries, when the US is the top trading partner for a little over 20 countries. So we have huge potential. The EU has also been relying on trade for prosperity. As you know, we've constructed the internal market, which is a free trade area with free mobility of labor and capital. And also, we've done a lot of trade and built up trade agreements externally. And we have a common trade policy, and we have adopted the euro to ease trade as well. That's a bit simplistic, but it's about it. So trade has been our growth engine, and the EU has been having an excess current account surplus for decades, which gives some power to the region. And I think that's important. But we have not been, it's not about being warrior on the war path at all, because we've been using trade for peace purposes too. As you know, the history of the construction of Europe, and I'm telling all this because this is shaping the way we think about economic statecraft. So we've been taking a positive approach to codependencies that's been intimately related to peace for us. It's the historic foundation of the coal and steel community. That was based on creating dependencies between France and Germany. And that has been working. And we've done it with other sectors. But the idea was really to prevent future wars. And we've been leveraging, I think, on a predictable, constantly developing international economic rules-based order. That has been very important for us, for firms doing business, and for consumer. So the rules-based global order is something we strongly believe into and want to preserve, but it's obviously being challenged. We also do believe in international cooperation for common public goods, climate, biodiversity, social progress. We, obviously, perhaps because we're small as well, we like using the power, the multiplicative power of multilateral organization. Think about the COP21, which was under the presidency of France, and which managed to strike the agreement that all of the planet committed to reduce carbon emission. I'm not sure just, it's leveraging on this ability to have international organization and countries talking to each other that helped us with that. Think about the French president One Planet Summit. And that's because this usage of multilateral organizations is super important when we talk about common goods, because we have only one planet, because China is producing 1/3 of global CO2 emissions. India's following closely because Brazil is key in biodiversity. For all those reasons, we have to work together. And we also believe, I was talking about rules-based order, and this is going to be the last point I want to highlight to explain why we think differently about economic statecraft. We believe in standard setting. We believe that because we have 440 million consumers, companies, firms will want to access the EU market. So if we ask them to abide by our standards to assess the market, they will do it because there's some benefits to make from this. And that is also creating a level playing field for EU companies producing high quality goods and services in the internal market. So I know we sometimes do not sound liberal, but I think we do believe in practice a lot more into free market and fair competition than many others. Okay. So I wanted to say how we see the key elements of statecraft and why we are different when we look at it. Now I'm going to explain the 3 pillars of our construction of economic statecraft. And the first one is about protecting the level playing field. And what I want to do here is to highlight all the instruments we have for that. But first, we want to protect this fair competition, free market. The second is we want to ensure that we'll get reciprocity from third countries. That's super important. And the third one is we're not naive, so we have been developing assertive instruments because the world is less kind today than it was 30 years ago. Okay, so the first pillar, we have trade defense instrument to protect the level playing field, and they are perfectly compatible with the WTO rules because we do like the rules-based order. So we have anti-dumping and anti-subsidies tools and safeguarding measures, and they are targeted for specific cases. For example, in 2021, the EU has actually been implementing 160 anti-dumping and 20 anti-subsidies measures, and more than half of them are targeting China. One of the challenges we've been facing is if you want to put in place these measures, you need the full cooperation of firms, obviously, and sometimes there's a cost attached to it. So that is why we have managed to protect, for example, our bicycle industry. You were talking about being practical, and not so well the solar panel industry. And we can come to that in the question. We also have a foreign subsidies regulation, which allows the European Union to forbid investment or acquisitions that are subsidized by foreign countries. Here again, what we want is to make sure that everyone is playing by the same rules of the game. It's not to prevent foreign acquisitions, but it's to make sure it's fair. It's actually very new because it came into force this January, and the Commission is now ready to launch its first investigations. And then we have the screening of foreign direct investment, which, as you all know, is a direct tool for protecting strategic assets within the single market. And that's fairly new as well, because the regulation was adopted in 2020. Now, this is perhaps, there's room for improvement. And we can discuss this later because this is a common rule, but it's being implemented on a voluntary basis at the national level. And only 18 out of 27 countries today have done so. That obviously leaves some vulnerabilities in our single market. But having said that, the number of strategic cases is rising sharply. So that was the first pillar, which is really creating a level playing field when firms come inside our market. Now there is ensuring reciprocity, which is about extending this to third countries. Here, I will talk about actually 3 points. The first one is we have an international procurement instrument. Let me just tell you that in 2016, 86% of public procurement in the EU was open to outside companies. But most of public procurement, for example, in China is restricted to Chinese companies. And this public procurement market, this is 14% of our GDP. So now with this tool, we're saying you can bid for our public market if you open your public market to the same extent. That's reciprocity. So we don't want to close ourselves, but we want others to open. Trade and investment agreement we use to enforce environmental and social standards. The idea being we ask that to our firms to have a level playing field and also to make sure that these standards get diffused outside of the EU. We ask the same thing to firms who want to do business with us. This is, for example, the EU will not be signing any investment agreement with China until China adopts the International Labour Organization Convention on Forced Labor. Same for other trade with deforestation. In fact, all the future trade agreements that the EU is going to sign will have to meet 3 criteria. Environmental sustainability, that's super important for us, like for you, I know. A well-designed balance of concessions. We want this to be fair. And the demonstration of the strategic interest of the agreement for the EU, which I'm sure you're all thinking, but that's obvious, right? It should be like that. But yeah, so that means the EU will not complete the Mercosur trade deals until it meets this criteria, and especially the Paris Agreement criteria. But it also means, conversely, that the EU has signed a trade agreement with New Zealand because it does meet those criteria. So it's trying to exert influence through trade, which I think is a very positive agenda. So that was the second pillar. And now there's the third one, which is a little more about assertive measures and which is also more recent, adjusting to the geopolitical situation. So here we have also three things I want to mention. The first one is industrial policy, because there is no strong geopolitical power without strong economics. And the world changing as fast as it is changing, we need to boost industrial policy. That used to be Olivier knows that, a very French expression, industrial policy. But I think now it's a very European as well. Then I want to talk about coercion instrument, and then a little about sanctions. So the most positive, I think, on the assertive side, it's this industrial policy. We just want to put Europe on par when it comes to technology and strategic sector with other regions of the world. So for this, we need cheap energy prices, and we're going to have that through the electricity market reform, which is in the process of being agreed. And it's the same, we want to remove our dependency on fossil fuel exporting countries. That means remove our dependency on fossil fuels, and that means remove our dependency on countries such as Russia. And by the way, on this, we reduced our gas consumption by 20% last year, meaning that we can do it and doing fast under pressure. But it's also about the development of other strategic sectors. And we do have a critical raw material act, which is actually in the process of being in an alliance with G7 countries, including the US. And I think the idea behind is it's quite new. It's about solidarity across the G7 and the EU to ensure that we have access to the raw materials we need for the energy and digital transition in a fair way with a variety of countries, which shows that partnership is important. We also have, we also have since Friday, our Inflation Reduction Act, except we call it Net Zero Industry Act. And it is not discriminatory. It's been designed in 3 months, which by European standard, and I think by any type of standard, is super fast. The main difference is any business that wants to do business in Europe in those strategic sectors can, provided it respects our standards, the economic, social, and environmental standards. But they will get subsidies, they will get state aid, they will get tax credit as long as they do that. So it's not very protectionist. Then we have the anti-coercion instrument. That's the second thing I wanted to talk about here. And here, the idea is just to deter economic coercive action, first through dialogue and engagement, but there are also possible retaliation measures. And I'm sure you've all read in the FT today that we have started launching this against China, which is exerting pressure on Lithuania. So that's putting to the test our bright new anti-coercion instrument. And then there are sanctions, obviously, which is the sort of last resort when that of Statecraft 2 that you may want to have. So 10 packages of sanctions against Russia have been adopted over the past year. And that includes individual targeting, so individuals related, obviously, to the war, about 1,500 of them, more than 2,000 entities, also sectoral measures, but you, I'm sure, know all this and have been discussing this, so I will not be too long on this. I just think it's worth highlighting that the scale and depth of sanction which have been imposed by G7 members are just totally unprecedented and will have a very big impact over the long term. So that's for the assertive measure. Now, we Europeans are perfect, but not totally perfect, obviously. So we're missing a few things, and let me highlight this before concluding. I think on FDI screening, we do need to be a little more organized, where we obviously have loopholes. I've mentioned ASEML. The regulation on FDI screening will be revised by the end of the year to ensure better EU coordination and also make sure we cover all the strategic assets and infrastructure in the European Union. That's about cybersecurity, that's about protecting cables for telecom and so on. Export control as well. Perhaps we need to extend a little beyond the dual usage and be more specific in which country we want, with which country we want to do this type of business and with which country we want some restrictions, or at least reflect on it and have some guideline and some benchmark to think about. And then there's an essential element, which we have been doing, but I think in a little, not well enough organized way, which is external partnership and development aid. The US does has a lot of public development aid. Are we as organized as some other countries? I'm not sure. And we've been very focused on helping countries for the transition, the energy transition, but perhaps there is more that we can do. And actually there is probably more than we can do in terms of aid. It is not balanced when we notice that, 1 in 2 large-scale infrastructure projects in Africa is being built by a Chinese company. It's not balanced when 1 in 3 is being funded by a Chinese bank. We do have the money. It's our interest to help and have constructive partnership with Africa as well. Just one last thing, and then I will be concluding. It's the same with the EU's neighborhood. And we may talk about this later, but as you know, in the Eastern and Southern European countries, there's a lot of Russia's influence. We have been granting candidate status to those countries, but I don't think that's enough in a way of exerting influence there and making sure that those countries are anchored with us rather than drifting away from us. So we have some projects. Obviously, they are funded by European institution, financial institution, but I think we need to do a lot more in this, and we can discuss that later. The same with Ukraine's reconstruction. That's an opportunity not to be missed. So I'll be stopping here. Let me just say that the European 1-year-old shift towards geoeconomics or economic statecraft is in no way something that is against the US or other partners with similar values. We think it should be built with the transatlantic partnership as well, and the critical raw material clubs I was mentioning is about this. We also think that this needs a little shift in the US narrative, not America first, but I think we need to work together for this. We have common interest in promoting our democratic values and free market and environmental values. And we need to move a little away from the blocks logics, which in our view has not delivered the best of the possible outcome in the last century, so we should not repeat this. And I think we have interest in working jointly on an equal footing as partner with equal power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Boone. That was terrific. And it shows how far you, France, and Europe have moved in the years since we started talking about this. There are so many questions, and I know the audience has some, but let me pick up on your last point. If the US government, whichever party is in power, since at the moment it doesn't seem to matter all that much, continues on this issue, on other issues, continues to be unilateralist and continues to press for more of a blocs approach. What role can Europe play? And is the role to wait for the US to come around? Is the role to quietly tell the US you're making a mistake? Is the role to ally with other, let's call them for the moment, third countries? Or, as some American pundits fear, is the role for Europe to pick up economic benefits from China that the Americans leave behind? How do you think about this?
So first, I don't think we are there at all, and we are engaged in many areas. First, I mean, remember President Macron came here to discuss following the Inflation Reduction Act. He was also the one who had raised this issue at the European Council. And the idea was to say that we should be working together. And I think we understood that there was nothing intentional against or in the bloc area. The more recent visit of Ursula von der Leyen talking about the critical raw material is, I think, also a demonstration that we can and are working together. We all have the same similar interest in diversifying our sources of raw material across countries. France had been working on this for about 18 months. Obviously, we don't have everything in Europe. You don't have everything in the US. And we're, by talking about this within the G7, within between Europe and the United States, and there will be a working group on this, we are mutually reinforcing each other in the type of materials, minings, minerals that we want to get. We're also moving, thanks to your influence, because, for example, we were very reluctant to do mining on the EU land, and now we are moving ahead with clean mining, but still, it's mining. And then I think there's been a constant dialogue, and this dialogue needs to be maintained and enhanced, and perhaps we can talk a lot more about it. Following the beginning of the Inflation Reduction Act discussion, we have a working group, as you know, between the US, PIIE, and the Commission, and there are regular discussion. There are also discussion on export controls or other areas. So we do engage in an intense dialogue, and I think this dialogue needs to be strengthened. We also are both present in multilateral institutions, and obviously we will have to continue exerting pressure there and acting with a united voice on this. And the last thing, I think when it comes to Ukraine, the US and the EU and the G7 have shown amazing unity. But there are very good foundation, but I think part of the answer to your question is we need to talk more. And at first, it's true, Europe was less versed into statecraft. But now that we are building up and not being shy as well of our power, right? I mean, it's not a European history to come and say, hey, look, we are geopolitical power like you. That's not us, but we were learning. And now that we can do that on an equal footing, we can actually partner when it comes to deal with Africa, when it comes to exchange with Asia and other countries.
You are a diplomat.
I'm learning.
It's part of geopolitical power. Following up on a specific instance, I thought you made a very clear statement in your speech, which of course runs through European policy, about thinking in terms of standards, not in terms of discrimination. We have an issue that I know the European governments and the US government have been discussing for some time, which is the different approaches in Europe with CBAM, with Carter border adjustment mechanisms, versus the US, and with, as our colleague Jacob Kierkegaard and others have written about, the very aggressive and I think constructive rising carbon price in Europe. In the US, there's a very different approach embodied in IRA and other things where there's no carbon price, there's some regulation and some subsidies. How do you see this going forward if Europe is to keep to its standards? If the US is not setting a carbon price, how do you see negotiating this?
So actually, this is a very interesting example because what's really striking to me is we European, with the policies we're putting in place, we're showing we believe in market forces. What do I mean by this? We're actually, with the tax, raising the price of fossil fuel, the relative price of fossil fuel, and decreasing the price of clean energy. And market consumers, firms should be responding to this. If you only do subsidies, what's the incentive for people to switch gear and change their habits? Very little, because it's also about being more efficient in the usage of energy. So that is like a reversed order where Europe is more pro-market in the way it's addressing climate change than what is being done here. I also believe that the standard setting is super important. We want other countries to change as well, and to change the way they produce goods, they produce services, the way we travel, the way we isolate our homes, the way we heat it in the winter. If you just focus on your own region, then you're not doing this in the standard setting as largely as I think we're trying to do. Because obviously firms who want to deal with us will have to adjust. Now, there is, I think, there is still some confusion sometimes when it comes to these policies, which is why, and we've been discussing this with you here, the OECD has been setting up this huge project to assess the efficacy of the various policies to reduce carbon emissions. And during the G7, Germany set up a climate club where things could be discussed there. My view is we're going to learn a lot over the next 2 to 3 years on how quickly we are shifting and transitioning, how quickly other policies are helping with that, and we will be able to learn from each other, hopefully.
Evidence-based research and policy is good, as you demonstrated as Deputy and Chief Economist at the OECD. If garbage fires don't interfere, my understanding is that French President Macron and EU President von der Leyen will be heading to Beijing soon. Could you say a bit, obviously not previewing what they're going to say, but could you say a bit more about, in the framework you set out, what is the message? What is the strategic purpose of this trip? In particular, since, as you mentioned, you now have the anti-coercion instrument, and Lithuania has been subject to pretty obvious attempts at coercion. How does this work? What do you think is the agenda there for EU and Beijing?
So I will use what you were saying. This is about diplomacy, and diplomacy means dialogue, and frank dialogue. So one of the things that obviously the trip is about Russia and the role of China, and having a frank discussion about what's desirable, what's not. But you can only do it if you do talk. The other one is precisely about these coercion things, and that China is trying to exert onto some European countries, and again having frank dialogue of what the consequences of doing this may be. And I think that's also very important, because if we show that we have instruments we're ready to use, and we are launching those, then there's a deterrence effect for spreading this type of behavior. And then it's also about making a statement on Europe, which is why Ursula von der Leyen is also going with the French president. But there will also be discussion on climate. There is, as you know, will be a summit on financing energy transition for the South in close to the G20 summit with India. which is about raising funding to help with the transition, and China has a role to play there. So it's precisely having a firm dialogue on geopolitical issues, on actually economic and reciprocity when you're engaging in economic relationship, and also talking about the common global goods.
So I'll turn to our esteemed audience for some in-person questions in a moment, but to follow up on that, one of the first official visitors to China after COVID reopening there was German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and he went off without somebody from the EU accompanying him, and he did bring a bunch of German multinational companies. Not asking you to comment on the behavior of your neighbor. We can do that. You've made reference to the fact about Europe has gone a long way towards unity, but has not fully unified or integrated. How do you see managing this kind of divergence or separable interests in Europe as Europe wants to exercise statecraft? And in particular, with sort of some of your previous roles in mind, what aspects of European integration, either economic or institutional, do you think would be best to prioritize?
Okay, so I think, and perhaps that allows me to complete the previous answer. I mean, being a partner in, being an actor in economic statecraft doesn't mean talking business with China. They can continue to buy lamps, and we can continue to sell tables, and we do. There are many areas where we want to do business together. There's nothing wrong with this. What I think Europe is engaging more, and European countries talk about this all the time in the European Council, and in a strategy of de-risking rather than decoupling. Now, I'm not saying it's 150% perfectly defined strategy, but that's the spirit, and that's how things are being approached. So yes, there are things you wouldn't want to build or sell or uncover, but there are other things for which you can perfectly do normal business, and this is good because we should never forget that trade, and you've been writing about this in a fantastic way, has been lifting a third of the world out of poverty. And there are still too many poor people, actually. So that's the first element which I think is important. The second one is we're going to do it the usual way that we do it, right? We sit around the table and we start arguing and discussing our arguments. But the good thing when you do that within a friendly area with quite like-minded countries is you converge to a solution that hopefully makes everyone as happy as possible or diminishes. It's about, it's nearly some kind of, there will be Pareto improvement on the current situation.
My final question from me is picking up on what you said earlier about the south and southeast of Europe and issues of potential enlargement and keeping EU members from not feeling drawn to Russia as opposed to Europe. Can you say a bit more about, from your perspective as Minister for Europe, how you see Ukrainian reconstruction, potential acceleration of Ukrainian or Georgian or whoever accession bids? How does this fit into the economic statecraft framework?
So I think there are at least two ways that we have to take into account when doing economic statecraft. The first thing is what's happening in Ukraine is obviously a revolution for us on the European continent. No one would have believed that it was possible to have war between Russia and another large European country, that we would see war just so short a time after the Second World War. And that has a profound implication on the way that the European Union will evolve over the years. I think the first super important things. It's our security to ensure that Russia, the Balkan countries, and basically the 10 candidate countries in the south and eastern neighborhood of the EU stay closer to us. And this is about doing business with them so that they can grow, making sure that we help them with talent as well, because it's so important to avoid brain drain. Doing partnership, whether it's universities, whether it's energy transition, whether it's digital transition, everything that's related to connectivity, to increase the connectivity with us, will be important. And the European political community, which was born in October last year, is precisely about that. That's the first thing. The second thing is I think it will be a different enlargement discussion than it was when we got Eastern European countries after the fall of the Berlin Wall scattered over the year. It will be a different enlargement discussion because it will have to include a security discussion. And that wasn't the case before. And so for this, we have a white page on which over the next 6 to 8 months, we need to fill up and have strategic discussions, which we have started.
Wonderful. Let me turn to our audience. If someone would like to either approach the mic or ask Jessica for the mic. Oh, come on, you're not a timid group. Please.
Said that IMF. I have a quick question about the financial cost of the different measures that you described, the net zero in the Net Zero Industry Act, the subsidies, the tax credits, and also the desire to increase external aid, namely to Africa. So, what is the scale of those measures, and in terms of financing, what are the sources?
So it's about 400 billion euros, so pretty similar to the figure which was announced by the US. I want to make something very clear. It's not about a race to subsidies at all. What we are, for two reasons at least. The first one is what we're doing is actually Europe has struck, in my view, the perfect balance to make sure that we could use in an optimal way state aid tax credit, but also the money that had been raised with common borrowing in the post-COVID, for the post-COVID recovery plans. It was a lot of money for infrastructure and for investment, and not all countries have been able to spend this money. We have had inflation, and when you talk about investment projects, it may take time, right? You have to design the project, you have to like in the US. So some of this money is being adjusted to those projects, which I think is essential and had been demanded by a lot of European countries. Can we reallocate some of the recovery plans to actually accelerate the transition and make sure that we can help our company address the higher energy prices? Because I think there's one thing to keep in mind when it comes to Europe and the US is we are paying a huge price in terms of high energy prices. And that was the first stone in the garden of, it was the first explanation to the competitiveness gap between the US and Europe before the Inflation Reduction Act. So all the money that we can direct to ensure production of low carbon energy at low prices with a lot of visibility is essential. The second thing is, and that has been, I think, a real wake-up call, make things simple. And very often in Europe, when we talk, we are not making things simple. First, I've been trying to talk about one of the regulation that we will have and package that we will have to answer the Inflation Reduction Act. As you know, we have many different with many titles. But so simplification, so state aid is part of the type of thing, tax credit is part of the type of things you can do. We are reducing permitting times, both at the EU level and at the national level. We have passed a law, the Germans have passed a law, we can accelerate and go much faster. We've asked the Commission to actually go much more quickly on the authorization. We said not 2 years, now it's 6 months, and our French view, 3 to 4 should be the max. So it's a lot about, you remember the famous ease of doing business. We want to, if this was still existed and was fairly computed, we want to be top of the list. Just one thing which is also related to what you were asking when it comes to Ukraine. I think in terms of overall support, we're all doing a great deal on the both sides of the Atlantic, and this is super important. We are already thinking about the reconstruction. Obviously, there's the IMF program, there's the G7 support. We had a conference with the private sector organized in Europe, in Paris. 700 firms attended to see how they could help reconstruct the country. And some of them wanted to start on areas where there's no bomb and strikes to show that it was possible. We will have to work together for this because the needs, the financial needs will be enormous. So Europe and the US and others will have to work jointly. And if you take European financial institution like the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which has the perfect name for this, it has capital from the US, from Canada, from us, from many other countries. For all of us, I think doing that jointly, the defense of the free democratic world will be necessary.
Right. We have time for one last question. Yes, please.
Thanks very much for this discussion. On trade, it seems that there's an inevitable tension between the desire for the EU to preserve the rules-based system and to maintain an open and reciprocal, including with China, and then the need or the desire to restrict supply chains to sort of like-minded. This is US language, which perhaps I'm imposing on you, or safe and secure. How do you see those tensions playing out in the US-EU relationship? It seems that the EU wants to be much less restrictive than the US, and yet you're arguing cooperation is essential. Thank you.
Thank you. First, there's something that I think is really important to highlight is all the tools we're using for Statecraft are compatible with the WTO. See, this is about made in Europe, not by European, what we're doing. And I think it's a huge difference because everything that we are doing, if any business from any country respects our economic, social, environmental standards, they can do business in Europe and they will benefit from the same condition as a European firm, including on tax credit or subsidies for strategic sector. I think that is key. And it's a big difference. The other thing that I want to say is, we don't want, you cannot, I don't feel, it's like if roles have been switched because we have been so much talking about protection, but we're not living in a risk-free world. What we want to do is reduce risks to a level that's compatible with our ambition, but we are not going to eliminate risks. So let's take a different strategic sector, health, right? We know now from experience that this is very strategic when it's the high end of the range, when it's biohealth, when it's vaccines, and the US has been amazing on this, by the way. So we need to invest more on that, also to be competitive, which I think is fair because when there's competition, there's innovation, and we need to preserve this. At the same time, we need to diversify the countries which are supplying the key elements going in there because we've learned the hard way that there is too much concentration. And there are some very, very strategic areas where we will need to have some production on site. But I think they have to be reduced to what's really strategic and essential, not yogurt, as we may have done in the past, if I may. And the last thing is, the best way to continue, I think we have a duty, the US and the European, to actually continue discussing and making sure that we can have, if not 150% aligned, we're not the same, but this ongoing discussion to make sure that we are at least coordinating, that we're aware of what we are doing, and how we are collaborating with the rest of the world. So it's being a little less naive, reducing risk probability, and being strategic in the countries we're dealing with.
Thank you. On that note of a practitioner and envisioner of economic statecraft, please join me in thanking Dr. Laurence Boone, France's Minister for Europe. This event, along with our global economic prospects earlier this morning, kicks off our broadly defined macro, which is starting now and runs through the IMF World Bank spring meetings. We have many distinguished speakers.